Margaret O'Connell had been staring at the same page of her late husband's ledger for the past hour, but the numbers kept blurring together like spilled ink in the rain. The oil lamp flickered on the kitchen table, casting dancing shadows across the worn wooden walls of the cabin that had been her home for 12 years. Outside, the Wyoming wind howled through the canyon, carrying with it the scent of sagebrush and the promise of another harsh winter. She set down the pencil and rubbed her tired eyes. The ledger told the same story it had been telling for months now. The cattle ranch was profitable, more profitable than most folks in Bear Creek Canyon realized. The spring water rights alone were worth a small fortune, especially with the railroad planning to expand westward through their valley. But being a woman alone on the frontier meant that prosperity came with its own set of dangers. The sound of horses approaching made Margaret's head snap up. She glanced at the old Henry rifle mounted above the fireplace, then at the clock on the mantel. 9:30 in the evening was no time for social calls, not out here where the nearest neighbor lived 8 miles away. She closed the ledger and smoothed down her dark blue dress. The one Patrick had always said brought out the color in her green eyes. Through the lace curtains, she could see 3 riders dismounting near the water trough. The lead man was tall and broad-shouldered, wearing a black hat and a long coat that screamed money and authority. Even in the lamplight, she recognized Silas Crawford, the territorial land commissioner who had been circling her property like a vulture ever since Patrick's funeral 6 months ago. Margaret walked to the front door but didn't open it. Instead, she pressed her ear against the solid oak wood that Patrick had cut and fitted himself. The men were talking in low voices, but their words carried clearly in the cold night air. "Remember, Crawford, we do this nice and legal-like," said a voice she didn't recognize. "The territorial government wants this land for the railroad, and they want it clean. No unnecessary complications." "Don't worry about complications," Crawford replied, his voice smooth as snake oil. "Mrs. O'Connell is a reasonable woman. She'll see the wisdom in accepting our generous offer." The third man chuckled, a sound like gravel in a tin cup. "And if she ain't reasonable? Then we'll help her understand the realities of frontier life for a woman alone," Crawford said. "The territorial authorities are very concerned about her safety out here. Accidents happen to isolated homesteads, fires, Indian raids, cattle rustling that goes too far." Margaret's blood turned to ice water in her veins. These weren't empty threats. Crawford had the backing of powerful men in Cheyenne and probably Washington. The railroad consortium wanted her land, and they had the political connections to take it one way or another. She stepped back from the door and considered her options. The Henry rifle held 15 rounds, but there were 3 of them, and Crawford wasn't the type to travel without insurance. Her nearest neighbor, old Pete Kowalski, was 8 miles away and deaf as a fence post anyway. The town sheriff was in Crawford's pocket, and the territorial marshal only came through Bear Creek Canyon twice a year. A heavy knock rattled the door frame. "Mrs. O'Connell, this is Commissioner Crawford. I'd like to have a word with you about your property situation." Margaret smoothed her dress again and walked to the window. She pulled the curtain aside just enough to show her face and spoke through the glass. "Commissioner Crawford, it's rather late for business calls. Perhaps you could return during daylight hours?" "I'm afraid this matter won't wait, ma'am. I have urgent territorial business to discuss with you. It concerns the safety and security of your holdings here." She let the curtain drop back into place and returned to the door, but kept it firmly closed. "My holdings are quite secure, thank you. My husband filed all the proper claims with the territorial office. Everything is legal and recorded." "That's exactly what we need to discuss," Crawford called through the door. "There have been some irregularities discovered in the filing process, some questions about water rights and boundary surveys. The territorial government is prepared to compensate you fairly for any inconvenience, but we need to settle this matter tonight." Margaret almost laughed at the transparency of it. Irregularities in Patrick's filings. Her husband had been a surveyor before he became a rancher. He knew territorial law better than most lawyers, and he'd filed their claims with military precision. There weren't any irregularities, just hungry men who wanted what she had built. Commissioner, I'm not comfortable conducting business at this hour. I'll be happy to meet with you tomorrow morning in town at the lawyer's office. The silence stretched for nearly a minute. Then Crawford's voice came again, harder now, with the friendly veneer stripped away. Mrs. O'Connell, I don't think you understand the seriousness of your situation. This isn't a request. The Territorial Authority requires your cooperation in this matter. And I don't think you understand my situation, Commissioner. Margaret's voice was steady, but she could feel her heart hammering against her ribs. I'm a lawful landowner conducting business on my own property. If you have legal documents that require my attention, you can present them through proper channels during business hours. She heard the men talking again, their voices more urgent now. One of them mentioned something about stubborn Irish women and making this harder than it needs to be. Mrs. O'Connell, Crawford called out again, I'm trying to be reasonable here. I'm trying to help you avoid unpleasantness. But my patience has limits. Open this door and let's discuss this like civilized people. Margaret walked back to the window and pulled the curtain aside again. This time she let them see her clearly, standing straight and tall with her chin raised. Commissioner Crawford, I am a civilized person. Civilized people don't conduct forced business transactions at gunpoint in the middle of the night. Crawford stepped closer to the window, and in the lamplight she could see the cold calculation in his eyes. Nobody mentioned guns, Mrs. O'Connell. But since you brought it up, I should point out that accidents happen on isolated ranches, especially to women who don't have the protection of a husband. Is that a threat, Commissioner? It's a reality check. You're a woman alone on thousands of acres of valuable land. The territorial government has a responsibility to ensure that such resources are properly developed and protected. We can't have strategic railroad routes controlled by people who might not have the best interests of territorial development at heart. Margaret felt something cold and hard settle in her stomach. This was it then, the moment Patrick had warned her about, the moment when powerful men decided that a woman couldn't possibly deserve what she had earned. But Patrick had also prepared her for this moment, in ways that went beyond the Henry rifle above the fireplace. Commissioner, I appreciate your concern for territorial development, but I should point out that this ranch has been continuously improved and developed since 1869. We've increased cattle production by 300%, improved water management systems, and established trade relationships with buyers as far east as Chicago. I hardly think my stewardship has been lacking. Crawford's laugh was ugly. Your stewardship? Mrs. O'Connell, with all due respect, you're a woman trying to run a cattle operation in country that breaks grown men. You might have been able to play at being a rancher when your husband was alive, but those days are over. The territorial government needs assurance that this land will be properly managed. That did it. Margaret felt the last of her patience evaporate like morning dew. She'd been running this ranch for 2 years before Patrick's death, handling the books, managing the hands, negotiating with buyers. She'd learned to shoot, to rope, to brand cattle, to read weather patterns and market fluctuations. She'd survived blizzards and droughts, cattle thieves and claim jumpers, territorial bureaucrats and traveling snake oil salesmen. Commissioner Crawford, she said, her voice dropping to a tone that Patrick used to call her Irish ice voice. I want you and your associates to leave my property immediately. Or what, Mrs. O'Connell? You'll call the sheriff. He's in town, 40 miles away. You'll write a letter to the territorial marshal. He won't see it for weeks. Face facts, woman. You're alone out here, and there's nothing you can do to stop us from taking what we came for. Margaret let the curtain fall back into place and walked to the center of the room. She stood there for a moment, thinking about Patrick and the life they'd built together. She thought about the cattle in the north pasture, the hands who depended on her for their wages, the contract she'd already signed for next spring's beef sales. She thought about the water rights that Crawford wanted so desperately, and the railroad that would make those rights worth more than gold. Then she thought about something else, something Crawford didn't know about, something that would make all his threats and intimidation meaningless. She walked back to the door and spoke through the solid oak. "Commissioner, you're absolutely right about one thing. I am a woman alone on the frontier, but you're wrong about everything else. I'm glad you're starting to see reason, Mrs. O'Connell. Now open this door and let's finish our business." Instead of opening the door, Margaret walked to the kitchen table and picked up a small brass bell. She rang it 3 times, paused, then rang it twice more. The clear notes echoed through the cabin and out into the night air. "What the hell was that?" she heard one of the men ask. Crawford's voice was sharper now, tinged with uncertainty. "Mrs. O'Connell, what are you doing?" Margaret returned to the door, and now she was smiling. It was the kind of smile Patrick had always said could stop a charging bull or melt a February blizzard, depending on her mood. Tonight, it was definitely the bull-stopping variety. "I'm calling my hands, Commissioner. You see, you made an incorrect assumption about my situation. You assumed I was alone." "Your ranch hands live in the bunkhouse 3 miles away," Crawford said, but his voice had lost some of its confidence. "Some of them do," Margaret agreed, "but others have been staying closer to the main house lately. There's been talk of trouble, you understand. Threats against isolated ranchers, the kind of threats that make a woman take precautions." As if on cue, the sound of running footsteps could be heard approaching from multiple directions. Margaret heard Crawford curse under his breath. "How many men do you have out there?" the commissioner demanded. Margaret's smile widened. "Enough, Mr. Crawford, more than enough." The truth was, she had 5 men positioned around the property. Tom Brady, her foreman, was in the barn loft with a clear view of the front yard. Miguel Vasquez and his brother Carlos were stationed behind the woodshed and the smokehouse, respectively. Young Billy Thompson was watching from the root cellar, and Sam Parker, her most experienced hand, was positioned behind the water trough where Crawford's horses were tied. But Crawford didn't know how many men she had or where they were positioned. All he knew was that his easy intimidation job had suddenly become a potential firefight with unknown odds. "This is territorial business, Mrs. O'Connell," Crawford called out, but his voice lacked its earlier authority. "Your ranch hands have no business interfering with government operations." "My ranch hands have every right to defend their employer's property against trespassers," Margaret replied. "Especially when those trespassers make threats in the middle of the night." She heard the men talking urgently among themselves, their voices too low to make out the words, but their tone clearly agitated. Margaret used the time to check the Henry rifle and ensure it was loaded, though she hoped it wouldn't come to shooting. Violence would only give Crawford and his territorial backers the excuse they needed to bring in federal marshals or even cavalry units. "Mrs. O'Connell," Crawford's voice was more controlled now, "I think there's been a misunderstanding here. We came to make you a generous offer for your property. Perhaps we chose the wrong time for our visit." "Perhaps you did, Commissioner. Business hours would have been more appropriate." "You're absolutely right. Let me propose this. We'll return tomorrow morning with the proper documentation. You can review our offer in daylight, with your attorney present if you wish." Margaret considered this. It was a retreat, but not a surrender. Crawford would be back, probably with more men and a different strategy. But it bought her time, and time was something she could use. "That would be acceptable, Commissioner. I'll expect you at 10 o'clock tomorrow morning, no earlier. And I'll want to see those territorial documents you mentioned." "Of course, Mrs. O'Connell. 10 o'clock it is." She heard the men mounting their horses, leather creaking and metal jangling in the cold air. But Crawford's voice came one more time, and this time the friendly mask was completely gone. "Mrs. O'Connell, I want you to think very carefully tonight about the offer we'll be making tomorrow. Think about your situation here. Think about how vulnerable you really are, despite tonight's theatrics. Think about what happens to stubborn people who stand in the way of territorial progress. Margaret walked back to the window and pulled the curtain aside one final time. Crawford was mounted on a large black horse, his face a pale blur under his dark hat. She met his gaze directly and let her smile return, softer this time, but no less determined. "Commissioner Crawford," she said, her voice carrying clearly through the glass, "you'll rue this moment. You'll rue the day you decided to threaten Margaret O'Connell on her own land." Crawford's face darkened, but he merely touched the brim of his hat in a mocking salute. "We'll see about that, Mrs. O'Connell. We'll see indeed." The three riders disappeared into the darkness, their horses' hoofbeats fading until only the wind remained. Margaret stood at the window for a long time, watching the empty yard and thinking about tomorrow. She heard her men moving around outside, taking up new positions for the night watch. Tom Brady's voice came from near the front door. "Mrs. O'Connell, they're gone, but we'll keep watch through the night. You get some rest." "Thank you, Tom. We'll talk in the morning." Margaret walked back to the kitchen table and opened Patrick's ledger again. The numbers were still there, solid and real. The ranch was profitable, the land was valuable, and the water rights were worth killing for. But she had something Crawford didn't expect: preparation, loyalty, and the kind of determination that comes from building something with your own hands and sweat. Margaret was awake before dawn, as was her custom. The first pale light was creeping over the eastern ridge when she walked out to the barn to find Tom Brady already saddling his horse. The foreman's weathered face was grim in the morning shadows. "Mrs. O'Connell, Miguel spotted riders coming up the south trail about an hour ago. They're moving slow, staying back in the trees, but there's more of them than last night, maybe 8 or 10 men." Margaret nodded, unsurprised. Crawford wasn't the type to make the same mistake twice. "Have you sent word to Pete Kowalski like I asked?" "Billy rode out at first light. Should reach the Kowalski place within the hour." Tom tightened his saddle cinch and looked at her directly. "Ma'am, I've been thinking about what you told us last night, about those territorial documents Crawford claims to have. There might be another way to handle this." "I'm listening." "My brother Jake works for the Territorial Land Office in Cheyenne. He's the one who processes all the filing paperwork. If Crawford's manufacturing fake irregularities in your husband's claims, Jake would know about it. More importantly, Jake would know who's behind it." Margaret felt a spark of hope. "How long would it take to get word to him?" "Telegraph from town, if the lines are working. Could have an answer by tomorrow morning." Tom paused, studying her face. "But that means getting to town, and Crawford's probably watching the main road. What about the old mining trail over Copper Ridge?" "It's rough country, especially this time of year. But it would get you to town without Crawford knowing." Tom's expression was troubled. "Ma'am, I don't like the idea of you riding alone through mountain country with those men prowling around." Margaret smiled. "Who said anything about riding alone?" 20 minutes later, she was mounted on her best horse, a sure-footed mountain mare named Patience, with Miguel Vasquez riding beside her on the trail toward Copper Ridge. The Mexican cowboy was small and wiry, but he knew the mountain trails better than anyone, and his rifle skills were legendary among the ranch hands. "Senora," Miguel said as they climbed through the aspen groves, "Tom told me about the water rights. How much are they worth?" "To the railroad? Probably $50,000, maybe more." Miguel whistled low. "No wonder Crawford came with guns." The trail was treacherous, winding through loose rock and fallen timber, but Patience picked her way carefully while Miguel's horse followed. They were making good time when Miguel suddenly raised his hand, signaling for silence. "Riders behind us," he whispered. Maybe 2 miles back, but they're pushing hard. Margaret felt her heart sink. Somehow, Crawford had anticipated this move. How many? Can't tell from here, but if they're following us up this trail, they know where we're going. They pushed their horses harder, but the mountain trail wasn't built for speed. Margaret's mind raced as she considered their options. If Crawford's men caught them in the open country between here and town, there would be no witnesses, no help coming. 2 people could disappear in the Wyoming mountains and never be found. Miguel, is there anywhere we can get off this trail? Somewhere we could hide until they pass? See, there's an old mine shaft about a mile ahead. We could hide the horses in there and wait. But as they rounded the next bend, Miguel pulled up short. 3 riders were waiting for them at the trail junction ahead, positioned to block any escape route toward town. Margaret recognized one of them as Crawford's companion from the night before. "Looks like they've got us boxed in," Miguel said quietly, his hand moving toward his rifle. "Wait." Margaret studied the men ahead, then glanced back down the trail where dust clouds marked their pursuers. "Miguel, how well do you know Sheriff Hendricks in town?" "Pretty well. He's honest, but he's scared of Crawford and the territorial people." "What if he had no choice? What if refusing to act would make him look like Crawford's paid man in front of witnesses?" Miguel's eyes lit up with understanding. "You're thinking about making this public." "Exactly. Crawford's power comes from working in shadows. If we force this into the open, in front of people who matter, he loses his biggest advantage." Margaret turned Patience around and started back down the trail at a steady trot. "We're not going to town, Miguel. We're going home, and we're going to make sure Crawford follows us." "Senora, that sounds like riding straight into a trap." "Sometimes the best way to avoid a trap is to spring it yourself, in a place of your own choosing." They rode hard back toward the ranch, with Crawford's men pursuing them just close enough to keep them in sight. Margaret counted at least 6 riders behind them, which meant Crawford had brought serious reinforcements for his morning visit. When they reached the ranch yard, Margaret dismounted and handed Patience's reins to Miguel. "Get the horses in the barn and take your position. Remember, we want them to come close, but not too close." Tom Brady appeared from the bunkhouse, his face tense. "Ma'am, Billy's back from the Kowalski place. Pete's on his way with his 2 boys and old Henry Garrett. Should be here within the hour." "Good. What about Crawford?" "He showed up right on time, 10 o'clock sharp. But he brought a lot more than paperwork." Tom gestured toward the front of the house, where Margaret could see at least a dozen men positioned around the yard. "He's got territorial deputies with him this time, wearing badges and everything." Margaret felt a chill. Territorial deputies meant this was no longer just about intimidation. Crawford had escalated to the point where he could claim legal authority for whatever he was planning. "Where is he now?" "Waiting on the front porch. Says he has documents that require your immediate signature." Margaret walked around to the front of the house, her boots crunching on the frost-covered ground. Crawford was indeed waiting on her porch, but he looked very different from the night before. He wore a formal black suit with a territorial deputy's badge pinned to his vest, and he carried an official-looking leather satchel. "Mrs. O'Connell," he called out as she approached, "I'm glad you could make time for our appointment. I have some very important documents here that require your attention." "I'm sure you do, Commissioner. But before we conduct any business, I'd like to see some identification. Last night you introduced yourself as a land commissioner, but today you're wearing a deputy's badge." Crawford's smile was cold. "I wear many hats in service to the territorial government, Mrs. O'Connell. Today I'm here as a deputy territorial marshal, with full authority to execute legal warrants and seizure orders." He opened the satchel and withdrew a thick sheaf of papers. These documents authorize the immediate seizure of this property, pending resolution of numerous filing irregularities and outstanding territorial taxes. You have the right to contest these findings, but such contest must be filed in the territorial capital within 30 days. Margaret took the papers and scanned them quickly. They looked official, complete with territorial seals and signatures, but something about them felt wrong. The language was too convenient, too specifically tailored to her situation. Commissioner, these documents claim that my husband failed to file proper water rights surveys, but Patrick filed 3 separate surveys with 3 different territorial offices. I have the receipts and acknowledgments. I'm afraid those earlier filings have been found to be insufficient. New territorial regulations require more detailed environmental impact assessments for water rights claims exceeding 100 acres. Margaret almost laughed. Environmental impact assessments? In Wyoming Territory in 1881? And when were these new regulations enacted? Crawford's pause was barely perceptible, but she caught it. Last month, all existing water rights holders were supposed to be notified by mail. Interesting. Because our mail comes through Bear Creek Station, and Postmaster Williams keeps very detailed records. I'm sure he'd remember delivering territorial notices to all the ranchers in the area. Crawford's expression hardened. Mrs. O'Connell, whether you received proper notification or not, these regulations are now in effect. You have 2 choices. Sign the voluntary transfer documents I've prepared, which include fair compensation for your inconvenience, or have the property seized under territorial authority with no compensation whatsoever. Margaret folded the papers carefully and looked around the yard. Crawford's men were positioned strategically, but they were also exposed. More importantly, she could see dust clouds approaching from the east, which meant Pete Kowalski and his boys were almost here. Commissioner, may I ask a question about the legal process here? Of course. Under territorial law, don't property seizures require the presence of the local sheriff or his designated representative? Crawford waved dismissively. I am a territorial deputy marshal. My authority supersedes local jurisdiction. But territorial regulations specifically state that local law enforcement must be notified and given opportunity to participate in property seizures. It's a checks and balances provision, designed to prevent abuse of territorial authority. Crawford's confident expression flickered. How could you possibly know territorial regulations in that detail? Margaret smiled. Commissioner, my late husband was a surveyor and land agent before he became a rancher. We have a complete set of territorial legal codes in our library, updated through last year's legislative session. I've had all night to research the proper procedures for what you're attempting to do. She could see uncertainty creeping into Crawford's eyes. He had counted on her being ignorant of territorial law. Just another frontier widow who could be bulldozed with official-looking papers and bureaucratic threats. Mrs. O'Connell, I don't think you understand the seriousness of this situation. These documents have been properly filed with the appropriate territorial offices. Have they? Because territorial law also requires that seizure documents be filed simultaneously with the Territorial Land Office, the Territorial Tax Office, and the Territorial Court System. Given that this is Tuesday and these documents are dated yesterday, that would mean they were filed on Monday. But Monday was the first day of the territorial legislative session, which means all territorial offices except emergency services were closed for the opening ceremonies. Crawford's face was beginning to flush red. Mrs. O'Connell, you're being deliberately obstructionist. I have the authority to proceed with or without your cooperation. You have the authority to proceed legally, Commissioner. But if these documents weren't properly filed according to territorial procedure, then you're not acting under legal authority. You're acting as a private citizen with armed men, attempting to seize property through intimidation. At that moment, Pete Kowalski and his 2 sons rode into the yard, followed by old Henry Garrett. Pete was a massive man with a gray beard and arms like tree trunks, and his boys had inherited his size and temperament. Henry Garrett was past 70, but he'd been a territorial judge before retiring to his small ranch, and he still commanded respect throughout the territory. "Morning, Maggie," Pete called out, dismounting near the water trough. "Got your message. Figured you might need some witnesses for whatever's happening here." Crawford looked distinctly uncomfortable as the four newcomers positioned themselves where they could see and hear everything. Henry Garrett walked directly up to the porch, his sharp old eyes taking in Crawford's badge and the armed men around the yard. "Deputy Crawford, isn't it? I remember you from territorial court sessions in Cheyenne. You're the land commissioner who tried to seize the Morrison Ranch last year on questionable documentation." Crawford's flush deepened. "Judge Garrett, this is territorial business, properly authorized and documented." "I'm sure it is. Mind if I take a look at those authorization papers?" Margaret handed the documents to the old judge, who examined them with the careful attention of someone who had seen every type of legal fraud attempted in frontier territory. "Interesting," Henry said after several minutes. "These water rights regulations you're citing, Commissioner. Section 47, subsection 12. When exactly were these enacted?" "Last month, as I told Mrs. O'Connell." Henry Garrett's weathered face creased in a thin smile. "Well now, that's remarkable, because I helped write Section 47 of the Territorial Water Rights Code, and I'm quite certain there is no subsection 12. In fact, Section 47 only goes up to subsection 8. The silence in the yard was deafening. Crawford's men shifted nervously, suddenly aware that they might not be on the right side of the law after all. "Furthermore," Henry continued, "these supposed filing irregularities you've cited. Patrick O'Connell's water rights were personally reviewed and approved by me when I was still on the bench. They were filed properly, documented thoroughly, and approved without reservation." Crawford's hand moved toward his gun, but Tom Brady's voice cut through the tension. "I wouldn't do that if I were you, Commissioner. You're surrounded by armed men, but so are we. And we're defending legally owned property against what appears to be an attempted fraudulent seizure." Margaret stepped forward, her voice calm but carrying clearly across the yard. "Commissioner Crawford, you have a choice to make. You can withdraw gracefully, return to Cheyenne, and explain to your superiors that the O'Connell Ranch seizure cannot proceed due to legal complications. Or you can continue with this fraud, in which case Judge Garrett and these other witnesses will testify that you attempted to seize property using forged territorial documents." Crawford looked around the yard, taking in the faces of the witnesses, the positioning of the ranch hands, the complete collapse of his carefully planned intimidation operation. The power dynamics had shifted completely. Instead of a helpless widow facing overwhelming force, he was now a territorial official facing exposure for attempted fraud in front of multiple credible witnesses. "This isn't over, Mrs. O'Connell," he said finally, his voice tight with frustrated anger. "Yes, Commissioner, it is." Margaret's smile was as sharp as a knife blade. "Because Judge Garrett isn't just a witness to what happened here today. He's also a correspondent for the Cheyenne Tribune, and I suspect this story would make very interesting reading for territorial voters." Henry Garrett nodded slowly. "Very interesting indeed. Territorial official attempts property seizure using forged documents. Yes, that would be front-page news." Crawford stared at Margaret for a long moment, and she could see him calculating odds, considering consequences, weighing his options against the complete destruction of his reputation and career. Finally, he gathered up his forged documents and stuffed them back into his satchel. "You think you've won something here, Mrs. O'Connell, but you're still a woman alone on valuable land. There are other ways to apply pressure, other authorities who might take an interest in your situation." Margaret's smile never wavered. "Commissioner, let me save you some time and effort. You're absolutely right that I'm a woman alone on valuable land. But you've made the same mistake a lot of men make out here. You assumed that being alone means being helpless. She gestured toward the men gathered in her yard. "These aren't just ranch hands and neighbors, Commissioner. Tom Brady here served with the 10th Cavalry. Miguel Vasquez fought with Benito Juarez in Mexico. Pete Kowalski was a sergeant in Sherman's March to the Sea. Henry Garrett helped write half the legal code you've been trying to circumvent." She stepped closer to Crawford, her voice dropping to a tone that carried absolute conviction. "I'm not alone, Commissioner. I'm part of a community of people who believe in legal property rights, honest government, and protecting each other from exactly the kind of corruption you represent." Crawford mounted his horse with jerky, angry movements. His men followed suit, their earlier confidence completely evaporated. But as he prepared to ride out, he leaned down from his saddle one final time. "You'll rue this moment, Mrs. O'Connell. You have no idea who you're crossing, or what resources they have at their disposal." Margaret let out a soft smile and stepped back toward her front door. "Commissioner Crawford, the only person who's going to rue this moment is you. Because tomorrow morning, Judge Garrett's newspaper article will be on every desk in the territorial capital, and everyone will know exactly what kind of man Silas Crawford really is." She opened her front door, stepped inside, and sealed it shut behind her. Through the window, she watched Crawford and his men ride away in defeat and humiliation, their carefully planned seizure operation completely destroyed by her preparation and the loyalty of good people. But as she watched them disappear into the distance, Margaret knew this victory was only the beginning. Men like Crawford didn't give up easily, and the forces behind him had too much at stake to walk away from valuable railroad land. The real test was still coming. She walked to her desk and began writing a letter to the territorial newspaper, detailing everything that had happened. The fight for her ranch was far from over, but today she had proven something important. A woman alone on the frontier didn't have to stay alone if she was smart enough to build alliances and brave enough to stand her ground when it mattered. Outside, her hands were already discussing watch schedules and defensive positions. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but tonight they had won something precious: time, credibility, and the knowledge that they could face whatever came next. The telegram arrived 3 days later, delivered by a nervous young man from the Bear Creek station who kept glancing over his shoulder as if expecting armed riders to appear at any moment. Margaret read the message twice before showing it to Tom Brady. "Territorial investigation initiated. Stop Crawford suspended pending inquiry. Stop armed escort dispatched. Stop J. Brady Territorial Land Office." Tom looked up from the telegram with a grim expression. "Ma'am, this is good news and bad news. Good news is Crawford's been suspended and can't act with official authority anymore. Bad news is desperate men do desperate things, and Crawford's got too much invested in this railroad deal to just walk away." Margaret folded the telegram and slipped it into her apron pocket. "How many men does he have left?" "Hard to say. Some of those territorial deputies probably went back to Cheyenne when word of the investigation got out. But Crawford's got private backing from the railroad consortium. They might have brought in hired guns from outside the territory." As if summoned by their conversation, Miguel Vasquez rode into the yard at a gallop, his horse lathered with sweat. He dismounted quickly and hurried toward the house. "Senora, we have big trouble. There's a camp set up in the South Canyon, maybe 15 men. They're not trying to hide anymore. They've got supply wagons and enough gear for a long stay." Margaret felt ice form in her stomach. "How far from the house?" "About 3 miles. Close enough to watch everything we do, but far enough that we can't get at them easily." Miguel paused, his expression troubled. "Senora? These are not territorial deputies or railroad men. These are professional gunfighters. I recognize some of them from wanted posters." Tom Brady cursed under his breath. "Crawford's brought in a private army. That means they're not planning to use legal pressure anymore." Margaret walked to the window and looked out at her land, the rolling pastures where cattle grazed peacefully, the water source that sparkled in the afternoon sun. Everything she and Patrick had built, Everything they had dreamed of was about to become a battlefield. "Tom, how many men can we count on?" "You've got 5 full-time hands plus myself. Pete Kowalski and his boys will stand with us, that's 4 more. Henry Garrett's too old to fight, but Billy Thompson's brother rode in this morning with 3 men from the Thompson Ranch. That gives us maybe 14 or 15 men total." Margaret did the math in her head. 15 defenders against possibly 20 attackers, fighting on ground she knew, but they were probably studying. The odds weren't impossible, but they weren't good either. "Ma'am," Tom continued, "there's something else you need to know. Word's gotten around the territory about what happened with Crawford. Folks are talking about it in every town and trading post from here to Colorado. You've become something of a symbol." "A symbol of what?" "Of standing up to corruption, of proving that regular folks can fight back against powerful men who think they can take whatever they want." Tom's weathered face creased in something that might have been pride. "There's talk of other ranchers and homesteaders who've been pressured by territorial officials. Some of them are thinking about fighting back too." Margaret absorbed this information slowly. She'd been so focused on her own land, her own fight, that she hadn't considered the broader implications of what she was doing. But if standing up to Crawford inspired other people to defend their rights, then this fight was about more than just one ranch. A new thought occurred to her. "Tom, you said your brother Jake works in the Territorial Land Office. Would he know about other cases like mine? Other properties that Crawford or his associates have tried to seize?" "Probably. Jake keeps detailed records on all land transactions and disputed claims. Send him another telegram. Ask him to compile a list of every questionable seizure or forced sale that Crawford has been involved with in the past 2 years. Names, dates, documentation. Everything." Tom looked puzzled. "Ma'am, what are you planning?" Margaret smiled, and this time it was the smile Patrick had always called her chess-playing smile, the one that meant she was thinking several moves ahead of everyone else. "I'm planning to end this fight permanently, not just for me, but for everyone Crawford has victimized." That evening, as shadows lengthened across the ranch yard, Margaret sat at her kitchen table with a stack of paper and her best pen. She was writing what might be the most important letter of her life, addressed to the editor of the largest newspaper in the Wyoming Territory. "Dear Editor," she began, "I am writing to inform the citizens of Wyoming Territory about a pattern of corruption and abuse that threatens the property rights of every homesteader, rancher, and settler in our territory." She wrote for 2 hours, documenting everything she knew about Crawford's methods, the forged documents he'd used, the intimidation tactics, the connections between territorial officials and the railroad consortium. But more than that, she wrote about the principle at stake, the right of honest citizens to own and develop land without fear of fraudulent seizure by corrupt officials. When she finished, she sealed the letter in an envelope and addressed it carefully. Tomorrow, Billy Thompson would ride to Cheyenne with the letter and the telegram from Tom's brother, along with copies of Crawford's forged documents and Henry Garrett's sworn statement about the legal irregularities. But as she prepared for bed, Margaret knew that Crawford wouldn't wait for newspapers and investigations to destroy his plans. He would move soon, probably within the next few days, and when he did, it would be with violence. She was right. The attack came at dawn on Friday morning, just as the first pink light was touching the eastern mountains. Margaret was already awake, sitting at her kitchen window with a cup of coffee and the Henry rifle across her lap, when the first shots rang out from the direction of the barn. She could see muzzle flashes from the tree line south of the house, and she heard Tom Brady's voice shouting orders to the men. The siege she had been expecting was finally beginning. But as the gunfire intensified, Margaret realized something was wrong with Crawford's plan. The attack was coming from only one direction, the south, which meant Crawford's men were all bunched together instead of surrounding the ranch buildings. Either he was overconfident, or he was missing something important. The missing piece became clear when she heard new gunfire from the north, behind Crawford's position. Margaret smiled grimly as she recognized the distinctive crack of Pete Kowalski's buffalo rifle. The old veteran had positioned his sons and some of the Thompson men in the woods north of Crawford's camp, and now they were attacking Crawford's gunmen from behind. Crawford had made a fatal tactical error. He'd assumed Margaret would hunker down defensively and wait to be overwhelmed. Instead, she'd planned an active defense that trapped his men between the ranch buildings and Pete's flanking force. The battle raged for nearly an hour, but the outcome was never really in doubt. Crawford's hired gunmen found themselves pinned between two groups of determined defenders who knew the country and had every advantage except numbers. As the morning wore on, several of Crawford's men tried to retreat, only to discover that their horses had been stampeded by Miguel Vasquez and Carlos, who had circled around to attack the gunmen's camp. When the shooting finally stopped, Margaret walked out of her house to survey the damage. 3 of Crawford's men lay dead in the pasture, and several more had been wounded. 2 of her own men had minor injuries, but no one on her side had been killed. Crawford himself was sitting propped against a tree, his left arm hanging useless at his side, and his expensive black suit torn and bloody. His arrogant confidence was completely gone, replaced by the hollow stare of a man who had gambled everything on one desperate play and lost completely. "Commissioner Crawford," Margaret said, stopping a few feet away from him, "I believe you have something that belongs to me." Crawford looked up at her with pain-glazed eyes. "What are you talking about?" "The real territorial documents authorizing the railroad surveys through this area. The ones that show exactly how much my water rights are worth and exactly which powerful men are behind this whole operation." Crawford's laugh was bitter. "You think I'd carry documents like that into a gunfight?" "No, Commissioner, but I think you'd keep them somewhere safe, somewhere you could access them quickly if you needed leverage or insurance." Margaret smiled. "Like the Territorial Land Office in Cheyenne. Filed under a false name or in a sealed envelope marked for emergency access only." Crawford's expression changed, and Margaret knew she'd guessed correctly. "You see, Commissioner, I've learned a few things about how territorial politics work. Men like you don't act without insurance policies. You don't risk everything unless you have something to fall back on, some way to bring down your partners if they abandon you." She knelt down beside Crawford, her voice dropping to a whisper. "Here's what's going to happen. You're going to tell me exactly where those documents are hidden and exactly who's been backing this railroad scheme. In return, I'm going to make sure you live long enough to reach a doctor and a jail cell." Crawford stared at her for a long moment, probably calculating whether he had any remaining leverage. Finally, his shoulders sagged in defeat. "There's a safety deposit box at the Cattleman's Bank in Cheyenne. Box number 47, registered under the name Samuel Morrison. The key is sewn into the lining of my coat pocket." Margaret found the key exactly where Crawford said it would be. It was small and brass, with the bank's distinctive marking. She slipped it into her pocket and stood up. "Tom," she called to her foreman, "get a wagon ready. We're taking Commissioner Crawford and his wounded men to town. They'll need medical attention before they stand trial." "What about the dead ones?" Tom asked. "We'll send word to their families if they have any. Everyone deserves a proper burial, even hired killers." As they loaded Crawford into the wagon, he looked up at Margaret one more time. "You have no idea what you've started. The Railroad Consortium has connections all the way to Washington. They won't let one frontier widow destroy $1 million development project." Margaret secured the tailgate of the wagon and checked Crawford's bandages. "Commissioner, you're right about one thing. I have started something, but it's not something that can be stopped by threats or violence or political connections." She gestured toward the men gathered around the wagon. Tom Brady and Miguel Vasquez, Pete Kowalski and his sons, the Thompson brothers, and a dozen other ranchers and farmers who had arrived during the night after word of the siege spread through the territory. What I've started is people realizing they don't have to accept corruption just because powerful men say it's legal. I've started honest citizens understanding that they can fight back if they stand together. Crawford was still trying to process this when Henry Garrett rode into the yard carrying a leather satchel. The old judge dismounted slowly and walked over to Margaret with a satisfied expression on his weathered face. "Maggie, I've got good news from Cheyenne. The territorial governor received Billy Thompson's delivery yesterday afternoon. Your letter, along with Tom Brady's brother's documentation of Crawford's other fraudulent seizures, plus the sworn statements from witnesses to Tuesday's attempted fraud." Henry opened his satchel and withdrew an official-looking document with territorial seals. "This is a warrant for Crawford's arrest on charges of fraud, conspiracy, and abuse of territorial authority. There's also a federal marshal on his way from Denver to investigate the railroad consortium's connections to territorial corruption." Margaret took the warrant and read it carefully. It was everything she had hoped for: complete vindication, official recognition of Crawford's crimes, and the promise of a broader investigation that would expose the whole corrupt network. "Judge, what happens to my ranch now?" Well, that's the interesting part. The Territorial Attorney General has issued a preliminary ruling that all properties seized or threatened by Crawford's fraudulent operations will be placed under territorial protection until the federal investigation is complete. No one can touch your land while the case is being resolved. Henry's eyes twinkled with amusement. But here's the really interesting part. The territorial governor was so impressed with your documentation of Crawford's crimes that he's asked you to serve as a special advisor on land rights protection. Seems the territory needs someone who understands both frontier law and how to stand up to corruption. Margaret stared at the old judge in amazement. "He wants me to work for the territorial government?" "Part-time consulting position. You'd help review disputed land claims and investigate reports of official abuse. Good pay, flexible schedule, and the authority to call in territorial marshals when needed." Margaret looked around at her ranch, her home, the land she and Patrick had built together. Then she looked at the men who had risked their lives to defend her and the neighbors who had stood with her against impossible odds. "Judge, I appreciate the offer, but I think I can do more good staying here, helping other ranchers and homesteaders learn how to protect themselves from the next Crawford who comes along." Henry Garrett smiled broadly. "Maggie, that's exactly what the governor hoped you'd say. The consulting position would let you do exactly that, with official backing and legal authority." 3 weeks later, Margaret stood on her front porch watching the sunrise paint the eastern mountains gold and crimson. The Crawford investigation had expanded beyond anyone's expectations, reaching into territorial offices, railroad boardrooms, and even congressional offices in Washington. Dozens of fraudulent land seizures had been reversed, corrupt officials had been arrested, and new laws were being written to protect property rights from exactly the kind of abuse she had suffered. Her ranch was secure now, more secure than it had ever been. The water rights that Crawford had tried to steal were now protected by federal court order, and the railroad consortium had been forced to negotiate fair compensation for any land they actually needed. But more importantly, the fight had changed her. She was no longer just a widow trying to hold on to her husband's legacy. She had become something new, a symbol of resistance to corruption, a voice for honest settlers throughout the territory, and a woman who had proven that being alone didn't mean being helpless. Tom Brady approached from the barn carrying the morning report on cattle prices and pasture conditions. But instead of the usual ranch business, he handed her a letter that had arrived with yesterday's mail. "Ma'am, this came from a widow in Colorado territory. Says she's heard about what you did with Crawford, and she's facing similar pressure from land speculators. She's asking for advice." Margaret opened the letter and read the familiar story. A woman alone on valuable land, facing intimidation from men who thought she'd be easy to push around. But this time, the woman wasn't asking for help. She was asking for guidance on how to help herself. Margaret smiled and walked back into her house to get paper and pen. She had work to do. 6 months later, the network of frontier women who had learned to protect their property rights from Margaret's example stretched from Wyoming to Texas, from Colorado to Montana. They called themselves the Frontier Women's Protection Association, and their simple motto was painted on a sign hanging beside Margaret's front door. Stand together, stand strong, stand free. Crawford himself had been sentenced to 5 years in territorial prison, and the Railroad Consortium's illegal activities had been exposed all the way to the highest levels of government. New federal laws protected homesteaders from fraudulent seizures, and territorial officials now knew that corrupt behavior would be met with swift and certain justice. But the most important change was in Margaret herself. She had sealed her door against threats and intimidation, and in doing so, she had opened a door to something much larger, the realization that ordinary people could fight corruption and win if they were brave enough to stand their ground and smart enough to stand together. Every morning when she looked out at her land, her cattle, her clear running water, Margaret remembered Patrick's words about the importance of building something worth defending. She had defended it, and in defending it, she had helped build something even more valuable, a community of people who refused to let powerful men steal their dreams. The frontier was still dangerous, still unforgiving, still full of men who thought they could take whatever they wanted by force or fraud. But now it was also full of people who knew they could fight back. People who had learned from Margaret O'Connell that being alone on the frontier didn't have to mean being helpless. And every evening, when she sealed her door against the Wyoming wind and darkness, Margaret smiled softly to herself, knowing that somewhere out there, other frontier families were doing the same thing, protecting what they'd built, defending what they'd earned, and proving that honest people working together could overcome any corruption, any threat, any powerful man who thought he could crush the dreams of ordinary settlers. Crawford had warned her she would rue the moment she defied him. But as Margaret settled into her chair by the fire each night, reading letters from women across the West who had found the courage to stand up for their rights, she knew the truth was exactly the opposite. Crawford was the one who would rue that moment for the rest of his life. The moment he underestimated a frontier widow who refused to be intimidated, who chose to seal her door against threats and open it to justice instead. She turned to a fresh page in the ledger and began to write. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but tonight she would plan. She would use every advantage she had. Every lesson Patrick had taught her, every connection she'd made in 12 years of frontier life. Crawford had made a mistake tonight. He'd assumed she was helpless, and he'd revealed his hand too early. Now she knew what she was facing, and she could prepare accordingly. Margaret O'Connell might be a woman alone on the frontier, but she was not defenseless, and before this was over, Commissioner Silas Crawford would learn exactly what that meant. She sealed the door shut and smiled softly to herself. The real fight was just beginning.